Thanks, Jordan. Thank you. And thanks, Mark, for that wonderful introduction. And just to start out with saying I'm such a big fan of Action for Happiness, so it's such a big pleasure to be here. It's like visiting St. Peter's after a long pilgrimage. And also just to start with an apology, English is not my first language, so sometimes I stumble over the words. Recently I had to audio record a new book I have coming out, and I realized I have real issues with V's and W's in a row. So for me, something like the Viking Warrior Review, I really struggle to get through that. So if there's anything that's unclear, just raise your hand and we'll try to solve it. I think I have about an hour, 50, 60 minutes, and we'll have some time for question afterwards. Basically what we do at the Happiness Research Institute is trying to answer these three questions. How do we measure happiness? Why are some people happier than others? And how do we improve quality of life? It's also what I wanted to share with you tonight. Some of you might have read my last book about hygge, the little book of hygge, for you. Yeah, that was, as you know, about this Danish concept about togetherness, about trying to create a nice atmosphere. I have a new book coming out which is much more about what can we learn from other cultures, what works in terms of improving quality of life. And it's also some of those cases I wanted to share with you tonight. Also a disclaimer, when you work with happiness, and I'm sure Mark and Richard also stumbles upon this, a lot of people, when they hear you work with happiness research, they imagine our offices looks somewhat like this. Basically, people holding up puppies in lab coats and checking whether it has an effect on happiness. Unfortunately, that's not the case. It looks more like this. A lot of people looking at numbers. Basically, we're trying to understand what are the patterns among those people that report high levels of happiness, whether you are from the UK or Denmark or China and India and so on. So that's what we try to achieve. One of our issues, of course, is that happiness is this umbrella term. Mark perhaps have one understanding of what happiness is. I have another one. And what we then need to do is to recognize that it is an umbrella term and look at the different dimensions or different elements that happiness consists of and break it down into those pieces. And I think it's an exercise we often do and forget that we do. When we talk about the economy, that is also an umbrella term. And we break it down into GDP, unemployment, interest rates, growth rates, and so on. And that gives us a language with different indicators and an ability to understand and talk about how the economy is doing. Is it going up? Is it going down? And that's what I think we also need to do when it comes to happiness or well-being or quality of life. All of those concepts are wide umbrella terms. So when we try and measure or capture happiness, we usually base our measures on 3 dimensions recommended by the OECD. And the first dimension is sometimes called the cognitive dimension. And that's essentially taking a step back and evaluating our lives. How happy are we with our life overall? Or imagine the best possible life you could lead, the worst possible life you could lead. Where do you feel you stand right now? That's the dimension that goes into the World Happiness Report. It's a very stable measure. You will probably answer the same thing to that question today as you do 2 weeks from now. This is also the dimension that Denmark and the rest of the Nordic and Scandinavian countries do well on. Another dimension is called the affective dimension. And that is much more about what kind of emotions we experience on an everyday basis, both positive and negative ones. So if you take yesterday, did you feel happy, sad, lonely, stressed, worried? And of course, those 2 dimensions overlap. If you have an everyday with a lot of positive emotions, you probably also report higher levels of life satisfaction. But we can still have lousy mornings and still feel good about our life overall. I think we also, here in the UK, actually have some really interesting data on the affective dimension. There is also a super interesting project going on under LSE called the Happiness Project. Look it up, download the app, help them get data. They already now have 3.5 million responses, and basically they prompt people one or several times a day, asking them where they are, how happy they are, what are they doing. And it started out as trying to figure out where are people happier. And they could see, well, people who are outdoors are happier, and people who are in green environmental areas are happier than people in the city. But now they can also see during what activities are people more or less happy. And the most miserable activity apparently is being home, ill, in bed. Second most miserable activity in the UK, any guesses?
Commuting.
Drunk, TV, work. Oh, commuting, that's a good bet. It was work. I'm sure commuting is up there as well. They could also see that Christmas Day, usually the happiest day in the year. Last year, the unhappiest day in the UK, November 9th, the day we woke up and Donald Trump was president. So I think it's interesting that we get data that even sort of reflects global events like this. This is the affective dimension, the quite volatile one. The third dimension is also sometimes referred to as the eudaimonic dimension. And that's just the ancient Greek word for happiness. That's the word that Aristotle used for happiness. And to him, the good life was the meaningful life. So here we're looking at whether people have a sense of purpose. And for instance, we can see kids have a tremendously positive effect on this dimension. On some of the other dimensions, the results are more mixed. And we'll get back to that later on. But then we can start to see how does different factors impact these three dimensions of happiness and how do they relate to one another. That's basically what we try to do. And ideally, what we do is we follow people over time. We could follow you, 10,000 people in the UK, 10,000 people in Denmark, over a decade, and then understand how does changes in your life circumstances impact these three dimensions of happiness. And that's also how we can overcome that you and I might have different perceptions of exactly what is life satisfaction or what is purpose. Because it's your development I'm interested in understanding what drives that. Does that make sense? Good. So essentially we're trying to do the same thing with happiness as scientists have done with understanding longevity. Why do some people live to see 100? Why do some people only live to see 40? Because of those studies, we know that smoking, alcohol, exercise, and diet matters. And we're trying to use the same tools and apply them to these massive data sets on happiness to understand some of the same things. The reports commissioned by the UN that Richard produces, together with other great scientists, the World Happiness Report, has around 155 countries in the ranking. Usually we see the Nordic countries do quite well in those. The Netherlands, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Switzerland are also usually in the top 10. But essentially we're interested in the full spectrum of countries, the 155 countries, and then understanding why do some countries do well, why are some people happier, and why are some people unhappy. And when we look at the data in the World Happiness Report, we can see that we can actually explain 75% of the variance, the difference between the countries, with quite few factors, which I think is super interesting. And it's also some of these factors I wanted to talk about tonight. I've been looking at what do people seem to do right around the world within these factors, and how can we get inspiration for them in order to improve how we live our own lives. So that's the plan. And one of the 6 factors is social support. Whether we look at global data or very local data, one of the best predictors of whether people are happy or not is whether we are happy with our relationships. We can use quite simple questions like this one Do you have somebody you can rely on in times of need? Yes or no? That's a binary question. The UK is around 10th place on this one. I think these are the OECD countries, or a bit more. We can also use a more complex definition of social support or loneliness. There's something called the UCLA loneliness scale. 20 questions that both measure the dimension that I might be lonely when I don't have anybody to be with, but also the dimension that I might be lonely in a crowded room like this if I have nobody I feel connected with or nobody that sort of gets me. So both dimensions are captured in this one. And we see the same whether we use this or the more simple tool before. This dimension often predicts whether people are happy or not. Our relationships are social support. So naturally, that's why we at the Happiness Research Institute have been interested in how do we create conditions, how do we create platforms for people to strengthen their social relationships and get a stronger sense of belonging, create communities and relationships. We've been looking at community gardens, planting one ourselves, looking at mini libraries. Not that they will change the world, but they might get you to start having a dialogue with your neighbor. So all these little things, I think, are good initiatives that can slowly over time help us put down roots and turn our streets into communities. And that is exactly what Shani has done. Shani lives in, Shani is on the right, a wonderful woman. She used to suffer from depression. And she lives in Holbert Street in Perth, which is in Western Australia. And what Shani did was completely transform her street from an ordinary street in an ordinary neighborhood in an ordinary city to a street that has movie nights and pizza nights. They have a common pizza oven. I'm not sure what this is, but it looks fun. Of course, they have a community garden, and they even have goats. I think it's super cool. I would love to grow up on a street that had goats. But essentially what Shani did was two things. She started out by getting to know her neighbors. I'm semi-introvert, so I know knocking on other people's doors is quite intimidating. But she went around to initially create a list of who lives on the street and what are people's phone numbers. But she also asked, what are people's interests? What do people like to do? What do people have and what do people need? And one guy wrote that he needed people to help him eat mulberries because in the mulberry season he had too many. And Brian in number 23, I think he had a wheelbarrow, so he would like that for that to be borrowed by other people. Anyways, she also discovered that there were 3 ladies on the street who enjoyed singing, and there was an ex-choir mistress. So naturally, they formed the Holbert Street Choir. And that was one of the first things. But I think also more importantly, she got people to dream about what the street could be like. And I think she basically used the philosophy from the author of The Little Prince. If you want people to do something, get them to dream about what it could be, instead of focusing on the tasks and the budget and so on. She asked people, what kind of street would you like to have? Don't worry about who's going to do what. Don't worry about the budget. But what kind of street would you like? And the kids, they dreamed of cricket games and soccer games. And the adults, they dreamed of afternoon tea and community gardens. And that was the beginning of a great transformation of the street. I think there was probably also an advantage in this street in particular because it was I think it's called cul-de-sac in English, so we call it a blind street. And in that sense, it was a defined community. So it's probably more difficult if you have a going through street. But having a defined community is also a great start. Of course, there's also an extra challenge in these days with social media. Social media can have positive and negative effects. Unfortunately, one of the negative effects is that we compare ourselves to each other, and it's very evident if you look at Facebook and Instagram that people are seemingly living these amazing lives. But it also sort of distracts us from being with the people we are actually with. So I think it's interesting to see what a Danish boarding school have done in order to create a community for the students at the school. So what they do is that at the beginning of the term, or the first semester, they take all the kids' phones, the iPads, all the devices, and they're 14 to 16, these kids. And then the kids can have their devices 1 hour per day to go on Snapchat and Instagram and so on. And after 6 months, it's put to a test among the students. Would you like to continue with the system we have today, or should we give everybody their phones back? And 80% vote to keep the system, because they realized when we all don't have our phones, we actually create something quite amazing together. And I think that's a super interesting case. If we can get that critical mass in terms of analog play, if we can call it that, then we could be onto something. Because if you're the only kid without your phone, then it's boring, right? So critical mass. So could we also perhaps talk with neighbors once we got the directory going and the choir and the pizza nights? Maybe we could also decide on Fridays, it's no phone Friday. And kids run and play in the street like I used to do. I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes now, get you together 2 and 2 or 3 and 3 or whatever fits with how you're sitting, and discuss additional ideas to how we can create better conditions for social connection and a sense of belonging. Anything will go, but spend 2 minutes and then we'll talk about some of the answers afterwards. Okay? Go. I don't think I've ever heard so much noise so soon for one of these. Wonderful. I'm really happy that there was so much to talk about also at that volume. Somebody want to throw out some of the ideas you had? Go to the gym? Sorry? What is... Ah, yes. Well, I thought you told me go to the gym. Anything else?
Conversation.
Conversation, yes. Do you have conversation salons in London? Yeah, I really love those. I think they're wonderful. Do you all know what they are? Okay, so strangers meet and talk in a structured, organized manner like we Danes like. So there are different topics and there is sort of a conductor that sort of leads the discussion, but you actually talk with 2 or 6 or 8 strangers in one night about social issues or what kind of city you would like to live in. It's an excellent concept. Yeah. In Danish we call them samtalesalonger. It would be translated to conversation salons. Yeah? Yes.
Trying to connect with people on the street around you, smiling, maybe saying the odd thing when you're in the supermarket.
Yep.
Even talking to the person next to you when they're sitting on the bus or the queue.
Yep, I agree. I did a small mini library in my stairway in Copenhagen. It's not as beautiful as the ones I've shown here, but just on top of the letterboxes, put out some books. And now I know more of the names of the people living in that stairway because it's a platform for conversation. And one of the great things about knowing your neighbors' names, it doesn't matter so much when they make noise afterwards. So that's a tip. But let's move on. Also, health, we can see, is one of the 6 factors that explain why some countries do better than others. And of course, there's several dimensions to health. These Korean masks were given to me by a young man from South Korea. We were sitting at my office, and I told him that my mother died many years ago when she was 49. And after that, he started to cry because his own mother also died when she was 49 from depression, as she said. However, there is a very large social stigma in South Korea concerning mental illness. So some in the family still believes that she was killed in a traffic accident. And he has now actually started a foundation in South Korea that wants to remove the stigma around social or mental illness. And I think it's really important to recognize how mental illness perhaps is the best thing a lot of governments can do to improve happiness levels or to reduce misery. And I also wanted to tell you that story because I think sometimes a lot of nuances are lost when people see these statistics when it comes to consumption of antidepressants. These are OECD numbers. We have 28, and the UK is actually the 6th country in terms of using antidepressants. And that's not necessarily a good thing, because it does mean that people are suffering from depression. But it also means that you have treatment that is available and affordable, and there is a lower social stigma about seeking help. If you look at the top of the list, the country from the bottom, the 2nd least consumption of antidepressants is in South Korea. It's not because they're not depressed, they're just not getting treatment. And then we can discuss whether it's the right sort of treatment we give people. But I think it's great, and you should take pride in this. According to the Economist Intelligence Unit, the UK is leading in terms of reducing social stigma around mental illness. Of course, there's a long way to go, but you're doing relatively well. And I think that's a great thing. And it's even something in Denmark we can learn from. And I also understand recently you had one of your members in the royal family coming forward talking about these things. I think that's a tremendously great thing. So just to keep in mind when you look at some of these statistics, it is also a testimony that people are seeking help, which is a great thing. Also, it's always a difficult thing to start a conversation around mental illness if you suspect somebody is going through a rough time. These might be helpful in starting that difficult conversation. All right. If we look at physical health, of course, we've also been interested in understanding why do some people in Europe exercise far more than others. You'll see Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Scandinavian countries, 1, 2, and 3. UK, for some reason, you're always 10th in these rankings. You just bought that place permanently. Yeah, we're going to get 10th place. But of course, I'm interested in understanding why is it that a lot of Danes get 5 hours of exercise per week. It's not because we like the gym. Stop telling me to go there. It's of course because exercise is built into our daily routine. I think it's great. 63% of our parliament members, they cycle to work. And honestly, we don't do it because it's good for exercise. We don't do it because it's good for the environment. Those are great side benefits. We do it because it's easy and convenient. Because there's infrastructure for pedestrians and cyclists. because the city is built for people and not for cars. So that's also why when we look at what kind of behavior drives well-being and what kind of policy drives well-being, those should, of course, be looked at together. I ride my bicycle in Copenhagen. There are a lot of cities I would not ride my bicycles in. The cities we have affect the behavior and the choices we make. Also, little things, because I wouldn't cycle in a lot of cities, but perhaps we could have this thinking of how do we put micro exercises into our daily routine. So I walk up the Empire State Building once a week, but I just do it in little turns. Because every time I get a cup of coffee at work, I walk up 4 floors at the top of the building and then back down, and then my coffee is ready. I drink a lot of coffee, but it does provide 100 stories per week. And I'll take that. Instead of waiting by the coffee machine, I get a bit of exercise because mainly my work is sitting like this. Okay? So these are some of the ways I would love us to think a little bit about. And yes, just so we're making time. So let's just spend another 2 minutes at that same incredible volume as we did before to discuss how else can we build in some exercise in our daily routine. Okay? Go. All right. Any ideas you want to share? Do less online. Yeah? Sorry? Dancing. Very good. Walking to the next bus stop. Yep. There's also apps. I think one of them is called Camino. You can download, and that will give you the scenic route to your destination instead of the fastest route. Other ideas? Walking, dancing. Doggies? Yes. Borrow dogs. I love dogs. Any other ideas? Take the stairs instead of the escalators. I completely agree. All right. Well done. We also need to talk a little bit about money. Unfortunately, it's primarily in Hollywood movies that money doesn't matter for happiness. But the reason why I chose this picture is because I think it's important to underline that the mechanism here is being without money is a cause of unhappiness. If we take European Social Survey and we look at low-income, high-income Europeans, we see this development. And as you can see, well, it's at the beginning of the increase in income that there is the big effect from low income to middle income and not from middle income to high income. It's also what economists call diminishing marginal returns, right? First piece of cake, excellent. Piece number 5, and of course it's the same with money. The first £1,000 we get, we buy food, we put a roof over our head. If you already have, I don't know, £100,000 per year, additional £1,000, you go out and buy this is a real thing. And I think it's fair to say that I think for a lot of us, we probably reached peak happiness for stuff, right? Float away. It doesn't even look happy, right? But I think we also have this phenomenon at a country level, that we have gotten richer and are struggling with figuring out how do we convert that wealth into well-being. I think we're struggling with that on a personal level. I think a lot of countries are struggling with that same question as well. And I think, coming back to South Korea, that is one of the cases where we see this. So this is 1960, Seoul. This is Seoul now. Incredible in terms of achieving growth over 60 years. Well done. But the trouble is they have failed to take that wealth and turn it into quality of life. We talked about the suicide rates before, but also people struggling in terms of finding a good work-life balance and quality in life in general. So I think one of the reasons why we don't get richer as we get happier is that we compare ourselves to other people. People care about their relative income instead of their absolute income. In South Korea, they have a saying, if one cousin buys land, the other cousin gets a stomachache. Because we care about the position in the social hierarchy. So social comparisons are one of these elements that explains why we don't necessarily get richer when we get, or happier when we get richer as a country. But I think we also need to experiment a little bit with how we can find enjoyment, happiness, quality of life without spending money, to try and decouple those two concepts. And you don't get to talk this time. I have to keep playing. So instead, I'm just going to talk to you about Michelle. She's actually from London. As you'll notice here, she rides a bicycle. She brought a homemade sandwich because she did an extreme experiment with this question I showed you before. How can we decouple wealth and well-being? She spent a year without spending money. So she spent money on her mortgage, on utilities, on food, which she cooked at home, but all the fun stuff, as she called it, all the pubs, the restaurant, no spending for 1 year, as an extreme experiment. What she found was, at the beginning, it was very difficult. Her timing was also difficult. She started out in November. It was cold. She had built up her social life around going to the pubs, going to the restaurants, and nobody wanted to join her for a walk in the park. But when May came, people were more likely to join her for those trips. And she started to learn how she could find a lot of free, fun activities. There's a lot of great art galleries in London. She went camping on the beach for down south in the summertime, cycling. But when I think of her story, I think it could also be fun to organize our social groups a little bit differently. Maybe we could have this free, fun fellowship where we take turns in organizing activities that are fun but free for everybody. So we don't necessarily always have to go to the pub or the restaurant, but we can actually have our relationships without spending money. I think that is an interesting exercise. What I like to do in Copenhagen, I like to go to the parks, I like to cycle around and explore the city, and I'm fortunate enough to live in a city where they've invested in cleaning up the water in the harbor so we can swim in the middle of the harbor. That brings me great pleasure in the summer. It's free. Of course, our summer lasts about 2 or 3 hours, but those 2 or 3 hours are great, okay? But that's also why I want governments to invest in quality of life for everyone. And I think it's super interesting that a lot of journalists will say, how can you be happy in Denmark? You pay some of the highest taxes in the world. Yes, we do pay some of the highest taxes. I pay 52% of my last earned kroner. And I do it with joy. And 88% of Danes will say they're happily paying their taxes. And they say that because they feel they get a lot of quality of life in return. So we don't see them as taxes, we see them as a public and private investment in quality of life. Okay? Which gives us some of these great things. Before I sound all communist, a little bit about freedom, which is also one of the factors we see explain why some countries do better than others. Do you feel you have the control over your life? Can you choose the life you want to live? We can see when we look at the Human Freedom Index and the World Happiness Report, there's a correlation among the countries' position in that one. Again, UK, 9th place in terms of freedom. You have Iran, Saudi Arabia, Central African Republic. Hong Kong is, I think, interestingly quite high on the freedom. But it's also how freedom is measured. So these are some of the indicators that is being used in the Human Freedom Index. I think it's a great index, but I do think it is missing a key component when it comes to freedom. Gender, it's in some way put in because they look at female inheritance rights and stuff like that. But I agree in terms of perhaps equality. I think also equality drives freedom or a high level of social mobility. That my path in life is not dictated by how much money my dad earned when I grew up. But I think another element is time. I think a lot of freedom indexes overlooks that. How much do we have to work in order to have a decent life? And what I notice from people who I speak with who move from London to Copenhagen, they all say the same thing. In London, I might have earned more money, but here I have a higher quality of life, and it always comes down to the work-life balance. The people leave the office at 4 or 5, and everybody does that. If you're there at 7, you're working on some madman project. And I spoke to one woman from London. She said, here, men will say, I can't take a client meeting at 4 because I have kiddie pickup. That would never happen in London, she says. I don't know whether you agree. Yeah. So I think, yes, we pay high taxes, but there's a higher quality of life. There's a different perception of values. We value time more than income in some instances. But with this work-life balance, I think it's also super interesting to see, and now we're coming back to the kids, how does having kids influence our life satisfaction? They had a wonderful effect on the sense of purpose. On life satisfaction, different results. If we look at the United States, parents are 12% less happy than non-parents. Okay? Denmark, parents are 2% less happy than non-parents. But in Sweden and Norway, which have even better family-friendly policies than Denmark, parents are happier than non-parents. And interestingly, Portugal, Spain have really much more happier parents than non-parents. So ideally, we should have Scandinavian family-friendly policies and Portuguese grandparents. Because I think that is what is going on with Portugal and Spain. They have different family structures, so you have 6 adults taking care of 1 kid instead of in, for example, Denmark. I assume also UK, you have 2 parents at best, right? We can also see most countries having kids, more negative impact on women than men when it comes to life satisfaction, because usually women take a larger share of the burden. Coming back to equality and women. Let me just see. I feel I kind of have to explain this one. So this is just a nuance of this. Usually we see when we look at global data, people are least happy midlife. But I think due to the work-life balance in Denmark, we see a different pattern. There's also some bad news in this sense, because it looks like we might be getting happier as we get old. The trouble is, happiness keeps people healthy. There's simply a lower mortality rate among happy people, which means as we grow old, the unhappy ones die off. That increases the average. Okay? Another reason to join Action for Happiness. I'm just saying. All right, so the last thing, last factor I wanted to cover is kindness or sense of generosity. which can, of course, also be difficult to measure. One study have looked at how likely are people to help if there is a undercover scientist, for example, acting like he's blind and wants to cross an intersection, or somebody dropping a pen on purpose. Are people helping him pick that up? And what they find is this ranking: New York, second from the bottom; Rio de Janeiro seems to be the kindest place according to these studies. On average, it looks like the more dense a city is, the less kind, with some exceptions. Do you think London is a kind place? No, they didn't do the study in the UK. Yeah. Where do you think UK or London would be? Think about it for a second. Okay. I'll let you answer that one. But I think in terms of kindness, I think there are so many great things to say about it. One thing is, those random acts of kindness, helping that blind person across the street. Apparently that gives us something called a helper's high. We're wired to feel good when we do good. But I think in terms of committing longer term, instead of just those random acts of kindness, volunteering, doing something for charity, has several benefits. It connects us with other people. It also gives us a second dimension to our identity. When we see and follow people over time, losing their job, of course, have really negative effects on their happiness. But as a volunteer, you also have a different story to tell when people ask you, so what do you do? As a common question in new conversations. It also gives us a sense of purpose, and also more importantly, I think, it gives us a sense of gratitude. I think a lot of volunteer work opens our eyes in terms of how perhaps less fortunate members of our society lives. And I think that's important to incorporate as well. Just looking at the watch for a second, I think we'll just actually, I'll talk about clock, okay? Do you know the free help guy? Okay, you should all go home and check him out. Sign up for his newsletter. So Clark is from London. He's undercover, and his real name is not Clark. I think he's the closest thing to a superhero I've met, and real inspiration. So he used to work in central London and took the tube every morning, but sort of felt not very passionate. And he wanted to do something else, wasn't sure what that would be, and he wanted to earn his worth in more than pounds and pennies. So without knowing exactly what to do, he quit and gave himself 6 months to figure that out. And then I think the first week he spent watching Breaking Bad. It was those days. But then, for some reason, after a week, he wrote on an online forum, "Is there anybody I can help? I'll do it for free." And he signed the free help guy. And the first people to reply, I think, were called Jill and Richard. And Jill and Richard had previously housed a homeless person. They had a spare room, they had housed a homeless person, but he had found a job and moved on. So they asked Clark, could he find them a new person to help? And that became the beginning of a long journey of helping strangers without wanting the publicity, but sitting next to a guy on planes to help him get over his fear of flying. He has tried to reunite a father with his son. He has acted as a guinea pig for a hypnotist. He got a letter from a set of parents that wanted him to help with finding a name for their new baby. He suggested Zeus. They went in a different direction. But he's had this incredible journey, and as he says, I think the person who has been helped the most by this is me. And my heart beats in a way that it never has before. And now he wants to make this permanent. He's done it beyond the 6 months. He wants it to be something that goes on even after he's gone. He sometimes needs people to help him and do help flash mobs. So it's also one of the options perhaps to consider. And that's actually one of the last things I wanted to say to you. This time, don't talk with your neighbor. And I'm not going to ask you afterwards, but let's just spend 30 or 40 seconds thinking about what kind of either random act of kindness you would like to do within the next 48 hours, or sign up to become a volunteer for Action for Happiness. They run these local online courses, or anything you would like to do within the next couple of days, and even better, perhaps also put it in your calendar as a reminder. So let's just think about that and potentially log it into our calendars in the next 30 seconds. Thank you. And the last thing I wanted to share with you was, these are the 6 factors we see all in all. And it's activities I've been looking for around the world to find pockets of happiness that seem to have a positive impact on people's lives. Finding cases, finding Shani's, finding Clark's, finding mini libraries, and to sort of bring those good things that does happen in the world into the light. I think last year the experience with Hygge was wonderful. So many people wrote me about these amazing things they've done because of Hygge, and now I wanted to give them an even broader collection of ideas they can incorporate and spread. And I think especially in times like these, turbulent times, it's easy to look at all the bad events that happen, but I think we also need to show people that there's still a lot of good things happening in the world and highlight that, okay? So I've found a lot of things I think work, but I really like you to be my eyes for that one as well. So if you find things, ideas, people, activities you believe have an effect on these 6 factors or on happiness in general, photograph it, write about it, put it on social media, tag me or whatever, because then we can use it in our work to come to further collect cases and ideas and inspiration. So thank you for that.
Mike, thank you so much. Please don't go anywhere, because one of the things we've asked Mike to do is to try and leave a lot of space for discussion here, because we've got with us someone who's really looked at the data on this. I know there's a lot of interest in this topic in the room, and I'm hoping we can really spark some interesting questions to dive into this. I was struck by the simplicity of some of the messages that come out of this in terms of how easy it is to potentially act on some of these things. Some friends of mine and I, well, I'm not heavily involved, but we're doing something this weekend near where I live called Play Streets, where we've arranged to shut off the street to cars, move our cars away, and get the neighbours together. And it struck me that you look at your list. Well, can you put your list back on? But actually, obviously getting neighbours together is great for social stuff. Actually, this is the kids outdoors, all of us outdoors. It's health. It's a great example of a money not required here. This is about back to basics, freedom. I mean, in fact, especially for the young people, they're kind of, I'm out to be able to go out on the road. I can draw on the street in chalk. I can run around. There's no cars. I can play ball. Yeah. There's a sense of control of your destiny. Definitely trust. People opening up their kind of gardens and their space around their house and so on. And actually, it's all motivated by kindness. So it's like actually, although not consciously doing it, this thing that's sprung up in our community and we've copied it from others is, it's just a nice example. It took a couple of people to kind of go, let's do this, and then a lot of people nearby have got involved, and it's actually, oh goodness, actually that seems to touch on that. So I wanted to cheekily ask you the first question, Mike, and I know you'll have things to ask Mike as well, but you've asked us, and I love how you got everyone to think about their own solutions, but you've looked at this in a lot of detail. What do you think are some of the most, simple but really kind of effective things that we should do, maybe looking at the UK as an example? So is it more about saying government should invest more in mental health, government should create more investment in clean water and cycling, or is it more about that we can change the culture through the things we do ourselves locally? Have you got a sort of sense of the answer to that?
Obviously, I think both should happen. I mean, I love what you're doing, and we should definitely have a bottom-up movement too, and I think once the political system recognizes that movement, they will also move their position in that sense. I really like your case, and I think that's actually a point I forgot to say. I think you're completely right. I think these building blocks also work together. And one of the great cases I found where they've, I think, managed to put these 6 pieces together is the project some of you might have heard of called Incredible Edible, where they come together and just plant a town with fruit trees and vegetable gardens. And basically the concept is if you eat, you're in. So it's for everybody. It's very inclusive. I think it started in Tottenham,
yeah.
And it's spread throughout the UK, now it's spreading throughout the world. And that touches upon all of those things as well.
Yeah.
So also, not just separate ideas, but finding out how can these things work together.
So we've got some microphones actually, and one of the things that was difficult earlier was obviously taking rapid fire responses. We couldn't hear everybody, but what I'd love to encourage us to do over this next little bit of time together is obviously ask a question to Mike, and if you can perhaps keep your questions as brief as possible. But actually also, if you have got little examples of things that you think are great examples of some of these things, why don't we share them here, little projects you're doing locally or things that you've seen work? Because I think one of the nice things about this community is just people have got some fantastic things they've come across and are doing. So could I, Alex, have you got microphones there? Is anyone would like to ask or share anything to kick us off? Let's take this gentleman here whose hand's on it first. Thanks, Fiona.
Can I share and give a question? So one of the clients I work with, we introduced, it's not original, but it's really worked well, no internal email on a Friday. So if the person exists and is in the building, you're not allowed to email that person. You have to go and find them and speak to them. So it adds social support and exercise as well if they're in a way off part of the building. One of the things I'd like to ask, I'm a positive psychologist and I'm fascinated with a number of areas. One is fixed and growth mindset, which is where my research is. The other is there a genetic predisposition to happiness? So if we look at Barbara Friedrichsen's work about set point, for example. And I'm wondering if in any of the research that you've looked at, are there countries that have a genetic predisposition to be happier or less miserable?
Yeah. We know that genetics matter. And we know that in part there are some really... there's a great twin register at the University of Minnesota. And they even have data from a period in the US where it was legal for 2 different sets of parents to adopt 1 twin each. So you have that scientific gold of identical genetic material that are brought up under different circumstances. When you look at the identical twins, whether they're brought up together or separately, they have they have the correlation between their happiness levels is medium strong. Whereas the non-identical twins, there's no correlation between their happiness levels. But with the identical genetic material, even if one twin is unemployed and single and the other one is employed and married, they will have fairly similar happiness levels. So genetics matter for happiness. And so does it for depression and schizophrenia. So yes, it should matter. And then you could say, well, should governments then do anything if genetics is a factor? But genetics is also a factor when it comes to health. We're born more or less healthy. We're predisposed for some diseases, but governments should still reduce air pollution in London. Governments should still install cycle paths so you can cycle to work. And the choices you make, the diet and the alcohol and so on, of course also matter. But yeah, genetics matter, at least according to the studies I've seen.
Thank you for that. Very good answer. And I love the little example of the No Email Friday. So if anyone else got little tweaks and tips like that, a lovely one I came across recently was sleep is a major cause of unhappiness and stress, or sleep problems around people staying up too late and pressure and digital media. A lovely little thing that I came across recently is setting an alarm to remind you to go to bed, which I thought was a rather nice little tweak on the old-fashioned way of doing it. Let's take a lady in the red dress in the middle here, and then... Oh, sorry, actually, the gentleman's already got a microphone, so we'll leave you with the mic and come back to you in a second. Over to you.
I was very intrigued by the chart you put up on the projector, the one about antidepressants. Now, I believe that you were using this idea that happier countries are where people are more prepared to seek support and health for mental illness. Is that right? But I mean, what seemed to me extraordinary was that the countries which are quite happy, like Norway, I think, was there, and several of the Scandinavian countries, Australia was there, as high levels of consumptions of antidepressants. So could it be, this is a rather provocative question, could it be that happiness is based on drug taking?
No and yes.
I think we've run out of time.
So antidepressants was developed in the 80s and scaled up early 90s. We have happiness data that goes back from the beginning of the 70s, and we see the same high levels. But my point was, without the medicine, you don't eliminate depression. You just have a situation where people are depressed and they're not getting treated. So I see the countries that are high in the consumption. Of course, it's an issue that some people feel depressed, feel they need antidepressants, but I see it as a good thing that they are comfortable enough with seeking help, and that help is affordable and available. And yes, I think it does increase happiness for those countries. I think if people are suffering from depression and we treat them, that lifts their happiness levels.
I wonder if there's a time component here, Mike, which is, of course, if somebody is able to acknowledge they're struggling and then seek help. And I think antidepressants are probably best used in the context of dealing with an acute issue, finding that frees up the mental space to then be able to look for therapeutic and other kinds of life-changing interventions, and then could get off the medication again.
Yeah.
I think where the data is really worrying is if it's a kind of, a crutch that somebody then relies on to survive and doesn't perhaps get other ways to improve their mental health. And so on. So I'm wondering if it's about time of use as much as volume of people that is of interest here.
Yeah.
Thank you for that good challenge, though. Very interesting question. Let's come to this lady with the red dress.
There was a book called I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. And in the book, the girl who had a lot of mental health problems is finally cured. And she asks her psychiatrist, will she be able to continue feeling happy and everything's fine? And her answer was, I never promised you a rose garden. And the reason I bring that up is because there are seasons of peace and seasons of war. And can you be happy when there's war? And my parents had a very, very tough time during World War II, and yet they were happy. So what is your answer to that? Can you be happy during war?
These are great questions, folks. Keep them going. I'm really glad I'm not answering these.
When we look at the countries that are at the bottom of the World Happiness Report, 155, 150, it's countries like Syria, Burundi, Central African Republic, Afghanistan, war-torn or civil war-torn countries. The happiness levels there, if we take a scale from 0 to 10, is around 3, where you have around 7.5 in the happiest countries. That's an average. You might have people report higher and lower than that, obviously. But I also like to touch upon what you started out with saying, never promised you a rose garden. I think that's also important for the work that we do in both organizations to highlight that we have the right to the pursuit of happiness. We also have the right to be unhappy from time to time. And earlier today there was a journalist who asked me, do you feel pressured to be happy because of the work that you do? And I said, on the contrary, I actually feel obliged to talk about when I'm not happy, because I think that's important to highlight also, that unhappy times and heartbreak and misery and financial distress and worry is part of that package that is called life. And hopefully we will get good conditions that enable us to lead good lives. But in that travel, there will also be periods where we're not in the rose garden. And I think that goes for everybody. So I think that's also important to mention when we are talking so much about happiness, that rose gardens are
a happy life isn't always about smiling all the time. It's about the reality of it. But I wonder if there's something also interesting. Often that you hear about the wartime spirit and that sort of thing. And actually, if you look back at Meik's 6 factors again, often when we're collectively under pressure, and nobody wants the horrific conflict and violence of war ever for anyone, but actually what I think you saw in the UK in sort of blitz spirit was a social connection, a looking beyond the financial, looking out for each other, more kindly. I mean, in some ways, in adversity, collectively, we respond with more kindness. You look at the amazing humanitarian responses to great tragedies and so on. That, you know, there's that lovely quote about look for the kindness whenever anything awful happens. You always see even more kindness in response to it. So sometimes I think these things wake us up to what really matters. Maybe, I don't know if that's fair. Let's take a question from a different. I'll take this one here, but then I'm conscious there's some hands upstairs. We might have to take some shouted out questions. So, lady here first, and then we'll.
And then exercise for the stairs.
Hi, Meik. I just wanted to ask you, mine was more of a two-part question. The first bit is about 15 to 20 years ago, the acronym SAD was used to describe Scandinavian countries in particular, where there's seasonal affective depression. And I wonder if a lot of your research and the striving to put Denmark and others, I mean, they're topping the list, supposedly, of these, happiness research institutes, came as a response to, in fact, that data that showed that countries that got less daylight hours were, in fact, subject to seasonal affective depression. So that was the first question, because obviously you've been really successful in tackling that. The thing that I find astonishing, though, is that in countries where there are high rates of suicide, and you touched on that, like South Korea and depression and things, they had a really bizarre response. And recently it was in the news where they had school children, probably you saw it, they put coffins next to their desks, and they said, okay, well, we have such high rates of suicide, we have to do something. And their solution was a sort of cultural sort of paradigm where they decided to punish them by locking them into these coffins and saying, well, if you think, suicide's going to be great, try being dead for a while, which seems opposite to all of the lists that you've provided. So I really wonder if there's any hope for countries which regard depression and mental health as being shameful, and therefore instead of encouraging all those positive attributes, they then go ahead and say, well, how would you like to be dead instead? So that's one thing that I find, what would you, say on a global platform? To educate those countries. And the second thing, which maybe it's a bit controversial, but you mentioned phone-free Fridays and the boarding school. Now, while it's easy enough in a boarding school to take away the iPads and the iPhones and things, obviously not going to be done globally. I have a daughter who's interested in artificial intelligence and computer science and things, and I recently went to a lecture at Imperial given by a very, prominent expert in the field. I don't think it's going away. I have to say that I honestly think it's sort of our generation and the previous generations, just like, they felt about steam trains and progression. We think we're going to halt that, and they're going to have this sort of come to Jesus moment and everyone's playing in the fields. It's really not, it's not heading, I hate to break the bubble, but it's not going in that direction. We are going forward with this. And I think a lot of the hygge and the stuff is really going to come from solutions that have come from SAD, for seasonal affective depression, which is creating alarm clocks that bring you daylight hours. It's going to come from the world of technology. So I don't want to burst the bubble, but it was a lovely picture. I don't think it's realistic. I don't think it's the future.
What are these steam trains you talk of?
Well, the Victorians,
No.
the Victorians
Kidding,
used to
kidding.
think the human body will shatter
Okay,
at
so
that speed.
basically there are three questions. I'll go with the first one and we'll just burst the bubble. Why were the Institute initiated? Basically was the first question. Was it the seasonal affective disorder?
Yeah.
No. We were established 5 years ago, basically because I was curious. Why do all the Scandinavian countries always do well?
But they didn't always do well, did they? Seasonal affective depression was a real
but
thing.
in terms of the happiness rankings. So I started the Happiness Research Institute because I wanted to explore that. And that was 5 years ago. The second question about South Korea, I completely agree, wrong strategy. I think one of the main issues with Korea is the intense competition there is in society. And I think that proverb also speaks of that. You know, if one cousin buys land, the other cousin gets a stomachache. They have the highest consumption of cosmetic surgery, ads in the subway, all your friends are getting work done, why aren't you? They have the highest degree of tertiary education, 80% get a university education. They compete to get into 3 main universities. They go to school, 80% go to school twice a day, from 9 to 4 and then from 6 to 9. 3 years ago, I think there was a national policy that forbids parents to homeschool their kids after 10 o'clock at night to put a curb on the pressure. They have one exam at the end of university that decides whether they go to those 3 universities. That pretty much determines their path in life. Offices open later that day. Planes are not allowed at the airport to keep quiet and keep the roads open. But more distressingly, they lock the rooftop terraces because they're afraid the kids will jump off. And I think instead we need to look at how do we remove that sense of competition among the students. And one of the great things is, in that sense, that little crack of light is a guy who's been in Denmark several times, a South Korean, who wants to learn from Denmark what can South Korea learn, have started a school after a Danish model to give the students a place to breathe and to be beyond that competition. And also, South Korea is actually the country we get most visits from at the Happiness Research Institute. They are recognizing that something is wrong. They want to change their ways. They are very curious and looking for inspiration. And one journalist said, we've been looking at the US as the big role model. That's where we wanted to go. Now we're not so sure that's the path we should follow. So I think they are working with...
So the coffin idea didn't come from you then? No.
Thank you for those fascinating questions. That's great. Mike, one thing about that, I mean, it's easy to look at a country and say, oh, that's terrible, that's happening. But actually, there's a sort of metaphor, I think, for us in that South Korean example, which is a lot of modern Western culture is geared around we're valued through our external success. It strikes me that what you've described as a system that encourages your worth is how you're seen, your success, your earning, your exam grades. We're kind of replicating that in lots of the UK, the US, and other countries as well. And in many ways, perhaps the solution to a mentally healthier culture is that ability to be, as Brené Brown would say, a little bit vulnerable, a little bit imperfect, not comparing yourself to the perfect images and so on, but just saying, you know, I am who I am, I'm okay with that. And there's that sense of being at peace with yourself in some ways is an antidote to that thing. And I think we could learn... I think we face a lot of the similar sort of dangers in the UK as you might in those examples, even though they're not quite as extreme. Time-wise, we've got about another sort of 5 minutes. Can I just see a show of hands if you'd like to ask questions? I did promise to take a couple from upstairs, so let's start with this lady with the stripy top. If you'd like to shout out your question, and we'll try and make sure everyone can hear it.
It links to what you were just saying, actually. I think it's quite interesting. In London in particular, and I'm sure many other places, there are probably lots of people who do, in the grand scheme of things, tick all 6 of those boxes, but for whatever reason are still not feeling fully content. And I think quite a bit of that comes back to appreciation and gratitude and being in the present moment and showing that gratitude towards the small things that then, mean something big to you. And a lot of people talk about gratitude, and I've been trying to build a gratitude practice and really struggled, writing them down at the end of the day, and it just didn't feel meaningful for me. So I actually decided the 1st of September, like last week, to try and capture one visual image a day of something that I was grateful for. And sometimes it's a big thing and a small thing. And I put it onto Facebook, and I've got about 330 people that are now involved and posting all these things. And it's really interesting seeing the themes coming out. A lot of dogs. a lot of people are in London, but a lot of people getting out into parks and appreciating nature. A lot around exercise. We had 2 for Zumba the other day. And it's just been really interesting, the engagement that there's been in that. And someone said today, yes, adding together the small things makes the biggest difference.
So I love that point. Just first of all, could people at the back here, could you hear what was being said there? Thank you for being so clear with what you said. I'll let Mike answer properly, but we always talk about this quote of enjoy the little things, because one day you may look back and realise they were the big things, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. I'd be fascinated to hear how your Facebook experiment goes, because we love gratitude, but there's, as Mike said, I think there's this danger when you're sharing on social media of comparing yourself or almost trying to present an image, and when people start going, oh, look at my lovely walk in the park, there's a little bit of like, oh, I didn't, And so I'd love to see if you can keep, the spirit it's obviously done with is obviously about sharing what matters to you, inspiring each other, but it'd be nice to be able to do that in a way that stays authentic and vulnerable, rather than going, oh, look at my perfect cake I baked, and all that sort of stuff that sometimes comes up. Perfect. That's I love that. Gratitude for washing machines. Yeah. How do you answer that, Mike?
But I agree with what you both said, and I especially also agree with you that it becomes this bombardment of great news that happens for everybody else. And actually also for the past couple of days I've been thinking I need to do a post on Facebook or Instagram, basically holding up a sign that says, these are highlights from my life, not my actual life. Usually I just spend my time spilling coffee and looking for my keys, because they are these edited highlights of our lives, right? So I think it's important also to show the washing machines and the dogs doing Zumba, was it?
Great. Okay, so and there was another hand-waving vigorously over here upstairs. I don't know if you can shout quite as loudly as we got there, but over to you.
Trust. Not at all, no. If we had 90 minutes, then that would be covered. We see also a high level of trust towards strangers, but also towards the political system, low level of corruption. And you can measure trust in different ways. You can ask people directly, do you feel most people can be trusted? Yes or no? And we see a correlation there with happy countries and trusting countries. One of my personal fun activities is to go around trust spotting. In Copenhagen, people leave their babies parked outside when they're inside having a cup of coffee. That, to me, is a manifestation of trust. But no, we didn't have time. Yeah.
It's one of the things that's touched us most with the volunteer-led courses that our People in Active Happiness run is that we measure things before and after these courses around personal well-being, but we also measure that trust question. Do you think most people can be trusted, or you can't be too careful? And we see that from getting together just with a local group for 8 weeks, and that you get this big increase in this sense of I trust others, that then sort of lasts. And that's just from getting together with people you didn't know before for a few weeks and so on. And it's like, actually, we have a potential to rebuild trust. And I think so much of modern society is putting trust under pressure, this sense of the world is full of evil people, and bad stuff happens everywhere. And I think the media gives us a much greater sense of worry about others than we need, or is indeed true.
Let's test that, actually. So you can also measure trustworthiness. So scientists go around, drop wallets. See, that was the W, right? Drop wallets on the streets containing a day's worth of pay and identification papers. And then they see how many of the wallets are returned with the money intact. It's been done in London. So let's start with how many believe that 10% of the wallets were returned? A few, 20%, 40, 60, 80. Okay, so a lot of, okay, that was actually quite high numbers. 42% of the wallets were returned with the money intact. Okay? Well done. So I think it's also interesting to then look at that gap. How much do we trust people, and how much could we actually trust?
But like 80% of these guys would have given it back by the look of
That's
things.
it. That's it. Trust levels are really high in Denmark. And then one time I forgot my phone on the train coming home, and I was like, it's gonna come back. I read all the statistics. It's gonna be here tomorrow. It was gone. I got really mad. Don't ruin my statistics.
What I'd like to do, I'd love to, I'm sure we could stay having these conversations, and I know that Mike and others here will be keen to stay behind and speak. I would just like to say before we close two specific things before we thank Mike. One is, this book is beautiful and looks very much like the Hygge one that came out last year, but actually it's got a real richness to it in terms of not just being about this lovely Danish lifestyle, but actually saying how do we apply some of this science with human stories in ways that it really can make a difference. So I'd really encourage you to look at it if you haven't already, and I'm sure Mike would be happy to sign copies if you have decided to get one this evening. Also, we have all kinds of events like this going on, as well as our courses and cafes. The next time we're together is actually in here again in about a month's time, the 5th, I think, of October, with Jeffrey Sachs, who's a fascinating economist, one of the leading kind of developmental thinkers around the world about how should we improve the lot of the world generally, and is also a co-author of the World Happiness Report. So he will be looking at some of the things we've talked about this evening, but also thinking, how can we shift culture? Western culture, he argues, has gone wrong. How can we rebuild the trust? How can we rebuild the sense of, well-being beyond wealth, and actually almost follow on from what you've said so eloquently this evening, Mike. So I wanted to invite you all to stay in this conversation, both this evening, but also involved in this movement, following up with Mike and his great work, and coming along to more of these and sharing your ideas. So thank you so much for being here, but most importantly, please join me in saying a massive thank you to Mike for all of his wisdom.
Thanks. Thank you.